Knox came to Perugia to study Italian in 2007. It was just weeks after her arrival that Meredith Kircher was brutally killed. Knox and her then boyfriend of just 1 week, Rafael Solecito, were soon arrested.
Hello and welcome to Real Crime Profile. I'm Jim Clemente, retired FBI profiler, former New York City prosecutor, and currently writer and producer on CBS's Criminal Minds. And with me today is...
Laura Richards, founder and director of Paladin, National Stalking Advocacy Service, and author of The Dash and the book Policing Domestic Violence.
And I'm Lisa Zambetti. I am the casting director for Criminal Minds, and I have a real interest in real crime and the minds that solve those crimes.
So today we have a very serious case to discuss that has been in the zeitgeist for the last 9 years. We're approaching the 9th anniversary of the murder of Meredith Kircher. This case took on just outrageous proportions when the media got a hold of this and got a hold of information that this case might have involved a female offender. And as a result of that, even more so than in some of the other cases that we have covered, the victim, Meredith Kircher, almost disappeared. She lost her voice when she lost her life, and that is a terrible thing that we are going to try to remedy right now. On November 1st, 2007, Meredith Kircher was brutally raped and murdered. And the main issue that kept repeating over and over and over again in the press was one of the suspects of that murder, not the victim herself. And unfortunately, what happened was a media feeding frenzy that apparently was fueled by the prosecutor's office. And in the end, after going through many years of trials and retrials and appeals, that issue was pretty much brought to the forefront. So why don't we start with who was Meredith Kircher? Laura, she came from the UK, didn't she?
She did. She was British. She was 21 at the time when she was murdered. She came from South London, from an area called Causden, which is close to Croydon. She was a student at the University of Leeds, and what's common for our students, particularly if you're doing European politics or languages, is that you may have a 4-year course where you might take a year placement and go to a particular country to study, more about their politics or the language. And funnily enough, University of Leeds was one of my choices of universities to go to. It's a very good university. It's up north. So she left London. It's a campus-based university, and it's seen as a very good university. And she took her year out, and she knew, or she and Amanda Knox knew each other, not for very long, but they decided that they were going to share a house together. Mm-hmm. But she came from a very close family, and I think it's important to probably also say that her family declined speaking out on the Netflix documentary. They have been exposed in the media a lot, and I think that for the first, when it happened, it was incredibly traumatic and chaotic, and her sister Stephanie spoke out initially, and then her brother did, and it was very difficult to get a true sense of who Meredith was, other than the family actually said something that was incredibly moving, which is that they wanted to remember her how she was to them, and not within this whole media circus of people painting her in a certain way,
right?
Which I thought they were trying to maintain their dignity, but also their memory of somebody who appeared to have been very vivacious and, a real bright light, and one that, of course, they will miss terribly.
And she's
Right.
the little sister, too. She's their little sister, I think, of 4 siblings, right?
Right. And I think, we'll talk about it in more detail later, but I believe that part of the reason why that Meredith was lost in this was that the prosecutor found it strategically important to try to actually muddy the waters with respect to who killed her and why they killed her, and to further his own agenda. In other words, he created a theory before he had any evidence based on ridiculously non-criminal, non-scientific, non-factual things, and then he tried to fit the facts and the people and the players into that theory, and that's why it took the better part of 7 years to actually resolve this case once and for all. But I remember you had said, I can't remember how you categorized it when they go away for a year.
Is it sort of a placement year or
Placement
a year
year.
out? I mean,
Okay.
on my course, I had a year out as well, where you go and work in the place or an organisation that you want to go on
Like an
to. And
internship.
certainly, yeah, and she did, European politics. So actually going, I'm not sure why her first choice was going to Italy, aside from it being a beautiful place. But maybe there was something in her course and they had an exchange set up.
Right.
If it was part of the Erasmus program, then there tends to be already that exchange process, and people then choose and they find the match of the place as well as, in terms of work that's going to expose them to things that they may want to go on to do.
Right. So here in the U.S., we call it an exchange program.
Mm-hmm.
She would be labeled as an exchange student, and she'd spend a year abroad. Lisa, did you do that in your college days?
I sure did, and I
Can you
remember.
tell us about that?
Yeah, whenever I hear about this case, I always think about that because, I walked by a bulletin board one day that had a whole bunch of brochures about studying abroad, and it just ignited my sense of adventure and my sense of romance, and I decided to go to England actually because I wanted to study Harold Pinter, who's a playwright, and the man on Pinter was at the University of London Goldsmiths College, and so that's where I went. And and you're so full of excitement and you're scared, but it's your parents are kind of freaking out because you're leaving home, but they're excited for you, but everybody's worried. And it's really an opportunity, I think, for many Americans, for the first time to go abroad, see another culture, and become almost a new person. You get to redefine who you are. You do find yourself. And
A question, Lisa, is this set up through a university kind of exchange?
Yes.
From your university to their university.
Yes.
The Goldsmiths University.
Exactly. So you go to a university so that all the classes you take count towards your year, so you don't lose any time. So
Right.
I took courses in Shakespeare and this and that, and it applied towards my degree. So it's not so much like taking a year out where you just are going abroad and having experiences working. It's definitely an
part of your
exchange
course.
of
Yeah.
credit. Yes, exactly.
That's the
Yeah,
same
and I didn't
thing.
get to do that particular thing because I was studying chemistry, and then in my junior year, at the end of my junior year, decided I wanted to go to law school, and so I had to kind of do an abrupt about face in terms of I had to take a lot more English and writing courses, and because I would mainly do math and science before. And so that was a tough year for me between my junior and senior years, and then I went to law school. But what I did, though, was I went to Europe for 2 months with my best friend from high school. And so we just got a Eurail pass. We
Right.
literally had no plans, zero plans,
Yeah.
other than we were flying into London and flying out of London like 2 months later. And so when we got there, we saw the city of London. We hiked around a bit. Then we got on the hovercraft to Calais, France, and then we got on we used our Eurail passes, and we just went to whatever city or country just caught our fancy, and mainly it was because we didn't have hotels. We would stay at hostels
Or
sometimes.
you sleep on the train. That's what I did.
you would find an 8-hour train ride and wake up in a different country, and there were all sorts of amazing adventures. And The thing is that, it's sad because that's what Meredith Kircher was looking for,
Right.
and an amazing adventure and learning things and meeting new people. And unfortunately, she met Rudy Gede in the horriblest of circumstances when he broke into their house and killed her. And he did disgusting things. And we'll get into those things a little later. But the fact is that she was the victim of a violent crime, and in much the same way that many of the other victims that we talk about, Nicole Simpson, and Ron Goldman, were similarly slaughtered, and in this case, unfortunately, Meredith suffered even more indignities, and it's something that we want. I mean, it's hard to talk about, but we want to put it in the forefront that this is what the case is actually about, not all those media headlines, not the things that some of the people and players involved wanted to get out of this case. But we'll talk about that later.
And it's probably important just to mention before we get into the detail that this is quite a controversial case in many ways. I mean, certainly the media covered it very differently in the UK to what was covered over here in the US, and people still have very entrenched views about it. And, I know Jim C. in the past, because we've discussed it, with a very serious focus at times about trolls who come onto your timeline. And the one thing that we request at Real Crime Profile is, yes, this is a controversial case. We want to make sure the victim's voice is absolutely heard. We will take you through sort of the evidence and assessment of the crime scene, as well as the Netflix documentary itself and various other aspects to that. But we just ask that if you are going to tweet us or message us, please do so and be kind and respectful when you do so, please. And keep that in mind when you're having a dialogue with us.
I have to say that overall, really considering all of the very controversial things we've talked about in our tenure here as podcasters, our listeners are so respectful, and they want to engage and they want to discuss things, and they have a lot to say. And certainly I kind of wince whenever you guys call me the voice of the people, because the people who listen to us are so much smarter than I and insightful. And on the whole, we don't have a lot of trolls, and I'm really glad about that, and I feel really lucky considering. But I take Laura's point that, some of these cases just inspire such high emotion, and people are in different camps. So I understand.
And just to say, it's not saying that our listeners currently, but it's just the way trolls work.
Right.
And
they seek it out.
Yeah, they do. And so I just want to, make sure that, those who know us know how we operate online and social media. And we do love to engage with our listeners. But certain subjects do attract certain trolls, and we will not deal with haters.
Right. We will talk about the facts and circumstances surrounding the case, but we won't engage with people who are just interested in personal attacks. And that's infantile. It's juvenile. It's something that should not be done. And we will respect the people who ask us questions and engage with us, no matter what their views are, as long as they're not being jerks about it and attacking.
And just personal attacks just to flame and create problems.
Right.
So.
Because you could even watch. I mean, you could watch South Park and see how they're dealing. There's a whole series about trolls on the South Park episodes at this point. And what's interesting is that they have very well, I mean, obviously it's a comedy, and they're very ironic about how they do it, but they've basically outlined what trolls actually do, that they literally attempt to push the buttons of whoever they're attacking, so that they will get a response, and then they'll get a response from people about that response. They love to see this.
Yeah, they want to light it
effect.
up. They definitely want to inflame.
Well, when you think about that, that's exactly what, for example, fire starters do. Pyromaniacs will start a fire because they want to see the response. They want to see the emergency response. They want to feel powerful. So if only trolls knew that what they were doing is leaking out information about their lack of power in their own lives, and the fact that they feel this need to attack others in order to feel better about themselves. It's illuminating to us, those of us who study human behavior. And it's unfortunate that people have to feel that way about themselves and then try to make other people feel bad about it. You can discuss the issues with us. That's fine. We have no problem talking to anybody about that, unless and until you start attacking us or our friends. I mean, we're here as professionals, and none of us are perfect, but we do take this seriously, and we just require that of our listeners. We are not here to attack people.
Right.
And I think, the documentary itself, if we start to talk about that, just to put it in the context of, Making a Murderer was obviously 10 hours, and, you've seen some particular, crime docus that are over a period of time, and then, some that are, for example, this one, 2 hours. And with a case that's this complex, it's an awful lot to fit in to a 2-hour window. So even what we're seeing, it doesn't present all of the evidence and all of the information. There's still a lot more that's outside of the documentary.
Right, and I think that you're bringing up a good point. It's a documentary. It's not a documentary series. And the thing that made Making a Murderer and People versus O.J. and others so popular was the fact that they spent more than just 2 hours discussing a particular topic. Because these cases, they're interesting because of all the twists and turns. They're interesting because there's so many details and because of the misinformation that's out there. And I think you're right that it didn't really have a lot of time to spend on those things in particular. Hello, it's Jim Clementi and Francie Hakes with a special message about a new show that I'm hosting on Wondery called Locked Up Abroad. In each episode, people tell their harrowing stories of being convicted of crimes and jailed in foreign lands, or kidnapped and held hostage in war-torn countries.
These are definitely worst-case scenarios. They're truly frightening situations.
Yes, no best cases here.
But it is fascinating to hear how they manage to survive these ordeals.
In the first episode, Midnight Express, Billy Hayes tells us about being imprisoned in Turkey for smuggling hashish. Oliver Stone even made a movie about it. But that was the movie. This is the real story. I even had the chance to interview Billy Hayes recently, and he told me the whole story behind the story of how he escaped a Turkish prison. He even told me that he went back to Turkey years later. You have to hear his story to believe it.
And now, in his own words, here is Billy Hayes.
Well, in defense of the documentary itself, there's always a scope that every documentarian tries to set for itself. And some want to be all-encompassing and go in every nook and cranny and either prove one side, prove the other, or whatever it is. And others are just taking a slice of something and putting just a slice of it under the microscope. And so, I really appreciated this documentary. I just thought, just visually, rhythmically, there was so much to absorb in it. I thought it was just masterfully done, regardless of what side of the coin it comes down on or what the point of view is. I just thought the use of music, the use of imagery, how they would use silences in their interviews, how they used the squeaky chair that Menini was sitting on, just that almost like it couldn't bear the weight of his ego.
I certainly agree with you that it was very well shot. I think from an artistic standpoint, it was beautifully done. Premium documentary work. The setup, the way they used the different characters, the way they kept coming back and visiting them, and just how elegantly it was done was very special. Obviously, I know a great deal about this case. I've been following it since the very beginning. I didn't get involved in it until 2 or 3 years ago, but I mean, really on an actual professional level, I'd kept up with it, just not really having time to delve into it. But I knew that one of my friends, Steve Moore, had gotten involved in it, and eventually he got me involved in the case. So I I was looking at it more towards how they were presenting the information rather than the body of information that they conveyed. I think they probably made some assumptions in terms of the public being aware of a certain amount of it, and they certainly advertised it as a story about Amanda Knox. Is she really innocent, or did she really get away with murder? And I think they kind of tried to play with that dichotomy throughout. And one of the things that I noticed, and it reinforced in me, nothing personal about Amanda, but she's not her best advocate. In other words, she doesn't do a great job in articulating exactly what was going on, exactly how she was being manipulated, and so forth. I think that she was living in it, and she's so in the weeds in it that she would have been helped by an outside perspective that actually could explain more her behavior. I mean, she was basically a college kid at the time, and she has matured since then, but she's matured under a tremendous amount of stress and strain, and it's obviously had an effect on her. And, of course, it had an effect on her life and her family, and Rafael Solecito and his life and his family. And I think those things, when we step back, Laura and I, from a behavioral perspective and look at that, hopefully we can lend a little of our professional experience in terms of explaining why these things happened and how the snowball effect occurred and how the media took it, and some, being very irresponsible, took it in a direction that was all aimed at grabbing headlines and not aimed at the truth.
Right. And, I do think that, if you put their two lives, Meredith Kercher and Amanda Knox, on a trajectory, they're both going away for the first time to somewhere that's hugely exciting, to kind of grow into adulthood, and then something terrible happens. And, I think from the outset, it seems that certainly in Italy, if you believe some of the other people who don't appear in the documentary actually, but who were there trying to find out more about Meredith Kercher and about, the victimology and about her life, what happened very quickly was this kind of turn in appetite where Amanda Knox comes under the microscope, and then we see very clearly that the attention is very much taken by the media not because of the female victim, but because of the potential female suspect. Mm-hmm. And, therein lies the challenge for me, even with the Netflix documentary, in that, I can understand why Meredith Kercher's family have refused to watch it and also refused to speak on it. Because for them, the primary victim is still Meredith, and, everybody else is seeing, the attention taken again by Amanda Knox. Now, that having been said, I can understand, that she is a victim in the process too, and, somebody who gets swept up within the media and within the criminal justice system. And I think really that's what this particular documentary is trying to portray, not just all the detail and the context of the case over sort of the 9 years. It's really trying to show how one thing led to another, and Amanda Knox's life was also changed forever, and trying to show a lens around that actually was incredibly revealing. But I can think, for the Kercher family, given that they feel that this is unfinished business, and I think that they feel that because of the way the media portrayed this case, I can absolutely understand why they want to give it no time, attention or energy, or give it a platform. And certainly don't want to talk about it. They would much rather see something from Meredith's, the perspective of the victim and what happened, and some of the unanswered questions that they still have as a family as to what went on.
Well, I would love to be able to provide them with that. And I think part of the reason why we're doing this today and why Real Crime Profile exists is to give the victim voice and to explain behavioral things that they may not understand, that people who have not had this training experience may not understand. And I think there is, as you mentioned about the media and the justice system and being swept up in that, and the victimization of of Amanda Knox and Raphael Solecito, there are certain times in which the justice system and the media unintentionally, inadvertently, wrongfully convicts. And then there are instances where it appears to be an intentional wrongful conviction. And this seems to be the latter. And because of that, it is an actual victimization, because it is an intentional act by somebody in a position of power. And then the use of the media, and the media being irresponsible, that perfect storm of those things that actually created this 9-year nightmare that still leaves Meredith's family with questions. So I would like to ask Laura, how did the UK cover this case differently than the US did? Because we really only saw the US version that we lived through.
And I think certainly, the UK was much more gripped by the victimology of Meredith Kercher, and, not necessarily through some of the tabloids who covered it. But I think, certainly she was forgotten, I felt, through looking at what was going on over here, because it was much more about the controversy of being, a female Amanda Knox. But that having been said, of course, it was the Daily Mail that was at the centre of, putting out a lot of the material very early on, that, Amanda Knox was a sex-crazed monster. And it kind of started very early from that point, and the nickname, Foxy Knoxy, that, was coined, and it became a very different story. But I think there were a lot of people in the UK and other journalists and other publications that were trying to talk more from a point of view of fact and from, the family perspective. But I do just want to draw a parallel, because I think it's something that to me is kind of quite staggering. And we covered the Nicole Simpson case and Ron Goldman, and the fact that they became a footnote in their own murder, which as did Meredith. But I would just like us, to discuss the fact, or to give a nod to it, that, O.J. Simpson, who was the person who was arrested, and, there was a full trial, that people found it very difficult to believe that he was the suspect, versus Amanda Knox, where everybody had, pretty much decided, certainly the tabloids and others, even if you asked people before this documentary what they thought had happened in this case, everyone seemed to have reached this foregone conclusion that Amanda Knox was guilty and this sex-crazed monster. But yet, on the other hand, the sportsman and celebrity O.J. Simpson, everyone found it incredibly difficult to think he's even capable of such a crime.
And just to put a caveat on that, Rudy Gede had already confessed, to the crime of killing her, that he was involved in it, and he tried to then sully the reputation and went along with all this prosecutor's theories about how it was a sex game gone wrong or something to that effect. But he was in jail for her murder already. When finally, after he had already been convicted, through his own guilty plea, that's when Amanda and Raphael were then charged. In other words, they were held in jail uncharged for almost a year before they were actually charged for this crime. And that was all so that the machinations that were later revealed by the prosecution and by the different experts that then testified, where they literally turned forensic evidence on its head. And that's one of the things that we'll get into it a lot more detail later.
But that's why it was so bizarre. They had the person, if anyone had done a crime scene assessment right from the start, unlike our prosecutor who seemed to think he was Sherlock Holmes reincarnated, which we all saw zero evidence of other than him wearing a smoking jacket.
What we saw was
and
3 letters.
Right.
We saw 3 letters, EGO. That's all. And that's what he lives for. And it was really unbelievable how he literally didn't even see. I can't imagine him understanding how he comes off, because he made pronouncements about, absolute pronouncements about what certain behavior means.
I was wondering when I was watching the documentary, I was like, oh, I wish Jim was sitting here next to me, because I was like, what do you think about that? He would make such grandiose statements, and from what scientific basis is he talking about? I mean,
I would have quite happily have sat next to you as well, Lisa, and talked you through his blanket statement of, that a man would never think about putting a blanket over a victim, but a female would. And this was the thing that jumped out at me right from the gate of...
He has no idea what he's talking about.
Exactly. And even just on that statement alone, you know that this is a person who's completely out of his depth, who has no understanding of serious and major crime. Because, of course, Jim, we have seen that many times.
Many times.
Bodies are being hidden or where there's undoing. And absolutely, it can be a male and or a female who may engage in that behaviour. But if that was his starting point, then, people around him clearly had no real chance in terms of, him forming these conclusions based on no evidence at all.
Right. And I think that when we get more into details about it, I mean, there are a number of outrageous comments that he made and conclusions that he drew from, for example, Amanda Knox and Raphael Solecito kissing and comforting each other outside. Remember, they did not know what the ultimate crime that had occurred was inside. All they knew is that the door got kicked in and she may be there on the ground under this blanket. They were scared to death. And the fact that Amanda had actually been in that apartment and walking around and showering and so forth, I mean, that has an effect. And also the fact that they had just met about a week prior.
Right. 5
and
days.
They were in the throes of bonding romantically to each other. And just the fact that he would comfort her in that way by kissing her and hugging her, and she would desire that comfort from him, is a very natural human response, especially under those circumstances. And then to have that twisted 180 degrees into something that's sinister. Actually, if she was sinister, if she was a sex-crazed vixen like they said, then you would have seen a completely different kind of response from her.
Right.
You would have seen a cold, calculated response from her. And they then, again, tried to fit, and this is exactly how you ruin an investigation, come up with a theory and then try to fit facts into that theory, as opposed to opening your mind, looking at all the facts, and then develop hypotheses that then you prove into a theory that actually makes sense.
Well, you test them out. There was no testing in this case. It was just the fact that he was saying he believed that this wasn't appropriate behaviour. Well, compared to what? I mean, how many people had he actually witnessed or interviewed in terms of committing major crime or seeing them in the throes thereafter?
It's all his ego.
It's all, down to him trying to play this super sleuth that, they already had an understanding of who it might have been. And I think certainly when I looked at that footage, and I remember it being on the UK newspapers actually, and, captured on camera, I certainly didn't see anything peculiar. It's not like they were, French kissing or doing things that were totally inappropriate. It was much more about that comforting, and concern, bearing in mind she's in a new country. Yes, they're in the throes of a new relationship, and it was much more a comforting thing. And I think, on their faces, it was very clear they didn't know what was going on.
It looked
Things
like
were
shock.
unfolding in front of them, and they had no understanding of what was happening other than it was something bad.
Right.
I mean, you could see that from their effect.
And I know that at the same time they commented about, at some point, Amanda doing some kind of stretching or gymnastics or something. Well, again, people who comment about that negatively should understand the fight or flight response. When somebody is under stress, your body or your primitive brain goes into this fight or flight mode. And what that does is it sends adrenaline and sugar to your extremities, and it increases your heart rate and it increases your breathing. And what that does is it gives you all this energy, and people who are inexperienced in this will find a way to exert that energy. And so that could be a very natural response for somebody, especially somebody who's not criminally sophisticated or hasn't gone through this process before and is very nervous about the situation. So, I mean, that's just one aside, because that's one tiny little thing that they kept harping on over the course of this debacle that was this case.
But also, if you had, really murdered somebody, couldn't, maybe your behavior would then be overly emotional and you would be crying and carrying on and still be guilty of a crime.
Yeah,
So
that's what I'm saying. Like, it would be calculated. Somebody who did what they accused her of doing, and in this premeditated, calculated way, would have more experience and would know how to, quote, present themselves in front of cameras after, they're being looked at with suspicion. But this documentary revealed, I think for the first time, why the Daily Mail was getting these scoops, these tabloid headlines, these outrageous, sex-crazed headlines, was because McNeely actually invited a reporter inside when everybody else was kept outside because he spoke Italian and gave him access to things that nobody else had. And then, according to this documentary and the reporter himself, he didn't bother fact-checking any of it.
That was shocking. That was,
He admitted.
He acted like, how could you possibly fact-check something?
But that's exactly what reporters have to do.
Exactly.
That's what they're called to do, real reporters. Yeah. And on top of that, he said, and then lose the scoop. So what was important for him, at least according to what this documentary said, was getting headlines, seeing his name in print, and being salacious. Nothing about facts, nothing about actually reporting facts. And that was the major problem in what I saw. And I thought that the documentary did a good job in bringing that out through his own words.
Right, but not only the reporter, it's the editor's job at those papers, as we all know from the Boston Globe, that they require you to have more than one source or more than one confirmation of what you're reporting. So the fact that he wasn't even held to that standard is...
It means it wasn't reporting.
Yes.
I mean, it is outrageous, but it doesn't surprise me given the tabloid that he was writing for. And, I think that he indicted himself, and the newspaper in terms of, through his own words, he convicts himself right at the end by saying, well, what did everyone expect me to do? To fact check all of these things and not ask questions as to why he's being fed all this information.
Right.
I mean, that should be the first thing on someone's radar of why am I being brought in and, given all of this information, why am I the person getting the scoop? And of course, that's all it was in terms of what mattered. And I think certainly some of those lines that he says on the Netflix documentary made my skin crawl. I mean, it was repugnant. There was no humility shown to the victim. This is a murder case that we're talking about. And this, again, for me, is why I think I felt such a visceral reaction to it. That, certainly with one of the comments of him saying that, what more would you want from a great murder story? Or well, maybe add the Pope or the royal family in. And then he just laughs in a very glebe kind of way. Which just, again, for the Kircher family, this must just feel horrific because it was just all about selling those headlines. And of course, it has had a very serious impact and consequence on the trial in terms of what happened next, but also in terms of vilifying, other people who were innocent, and also how it must feel for the family and friends seeing these things because they do genuinely feel that they have unanswered questions. And I think a lot of that comes down to how they've been liaised with in terms of the Italian criminal justice system, but what they read in the media, which is what they think is fact, versus actually, there are a lot of things that, the family, in fact, somebody should sit down with them and go through all the forensic evidence and what was, fact and what was evidence versus what was salacious news headline grabbing, as we heard from that journalist, and I remember that one part where he says, I mean, I had the headline, just headline after headline after headline, 34 headlines. It was better than sex.
And that's like I said, right. One of the great things that this documentary did was allow these people who were clearly egomaniacs, who clearly had, in my mind, insecurities through the roof, this is how they got their jollies by being famous because of Meredith Kercher's murder, brutal murder. They made themselves famous off of her death, and that's disgusting and repugnant. The fact is that the documentary let them hang themselves.
Exactly. That's
let them speak.
Yeah.
And it was their own words, And they actually, obviously, were so self-interested, and they
That's a
didn't
great
care about the
observation,
truth.
Absolutely.
But where was the editor? You know, and I do think, you know, yes, you can give somebody enough rope and they do eventually hang themselves. And unfortunately with this particular tabloid, I've seen it time and time and time and time again, where they present a story as fact when actually there are zero facts to corroborate it. So actually, we do have press standards, and you'll remember that you know, we had the Leveson inquiry about phone tapping and leaked information, and you know, and I noticed the Netflix documentary kind of gave a nod to that. But this is not an expected standard, you know, in the UK, and I actually feel that there should be serious consequences. And I don't know what, you know, both families are doing in terms of, you know, trying to redress this, because I do believe that it steered the trial and the actions of the officials in a certain way. And it was almost like, you know, there's no evidence, but I'm going to present this as a fait accompli, that this is what happened before the trial, bear in mind. This isn't even, you know, during the trial. And then everyone tends to bought into that particular you know, charade about this whole sex crazed monster story. But at the same time, like you said, Jim, the Rudy Guide trial was a separate trial that was running and had run, but yet there was so little coverage about that.
Right.
But yet the journalist, when he talks about it, just said, well, you know, effectively, I'm not saying it verbatim, but he said, well, we had no interest in him.
Right.
The actual offender who did it, we were much more interested in Amanda Knox because she was a female.
Right. And if you look at that, the trial and the case against Rudy Guede and what it was based on, how he became a suspect, and the information that came out afterwards, and then the meeting with McNeely, and then how he changed his statement and then actually testified. But even the content of his testimony was so ridiculous that he recognized Amanda Knox fleeing from the apartment. He saw her silhouette, and that's how she was identified in this case. That's what tied her to this case. And so then we get to what should have happened in the first place, the forensic evaluation, the forensic collection of evidence. We have a show here in the U.S. called Are You Smarter Than a Third Grader or a Fifth Grader or something like that, right? Well, these third graders and fifth graders and kindergarten people could probably teach the forensic collectors of evidence a thing or two, because they were wearing forensic white suits. They're Tyvek suits typically. They don't tear easily, and they're supposed to cover your clothes so you don't leave forensic evidence behind. You're supposed to wear a mask and something to cover your hair so you're not dropping things, because skin cells slough off your body and your hair falls off, and
Constantly, yeah.
and all sorts of things that can contaminate a crime scene. And then you wear booties, okay? And that is supposed to be to prevent you from walking in one crime scene and bringing that stuff to another part of the crime scene. And then you wear gloves. And again, it's meant to prevent you from transferring something from one part of the scene to another.
And you should repeatedly change
I
those.
was going to ask that. Yeah,
Every
so you're
time
supposed
you
to
touch
change. I was going to
something.
ask, yeah.
Every single time you touch any surface, you have to change your gloves. When a pair of those rubber gloves touches a doorknob that, let's say, Raphael was trying to rattle so that he could try to get into the room, his DNA transfers onto those gloves. And then anything you touch after that with those gloves, you can transfer in a secondary or tertiary way his DNA. And if that's what happened, and that very well most likely did happen, then any evidence that's touched after that is completely worthless forensically. So let's talk about some of that evidence. The most damning piece of evidence for Raphael was a bra clasp that was found on the floor of Meredith Kircher's room. But it wasn't found in the original search, or if it was discarded at that time. But it's actually the piece of the bra clasp. It's a piece of the bra and clasp that was part of the bra that she was wearing at the time she was murdered. And this became a critical piece of evidence that they didn't even know about until, I believe, more than 40 days later, when they went back and researched that apartment. And fortunately for us, and unfortunately for them, they actually took a running video of what they were doing. And you can actually see in some of the videos where these supposedly trained crime scene investigators with their booties on were literally kicking things across the floor with their booty, across bloodstains, across everything that's already there in the course of this search. And then lifting up a rolled up, matted up floor mat or carpet, and finding the bra clasp underneath that, and then picking it up literally by the clasp, showing it to another person, handing it off to that other person, they're touching it with their gloves, handing it off to a third person, and then throwing it back on the floor and photographing it as if this was when they first found it. Now, to me, if I was a judge, if I was a defense attorney, I would just play that 15 or 20 seconds of video, and I would say, you need to throw out all the forensic evidence in this case. They have created a hole so wide you could drive a truck through it in terms of what you do to get forensic evidence excluded from a court of law. Once it's touched by gloves that have touched another surface, it's already contaminated, because today DNA evidence is so sensitive. You can get just a couple of cells, something that's quite microscopic. You can find that and get the DNA from it if you have the right technology. Well, that's all the time we have right now, and we'll be back next week talking about the Meredith Kircher case. Make sure that you write us questions and post them for us on our Facebook page or on Twitter, and we will try to address all the questions we can. If you have issues that you don't understand or you disagree on, we'd be happy to hear about it, as long as everybody's respectful, and then we'll go forward and get more details out about the case.
So if you enjoy our podcast and would like to support us, there are a couple of important things you can do. First, you can go over to iTunes and give us a positive 5-star review. You can check out our sponsors and take advantage of the special promotions for Real Crime Profile listeners. You can go over and like our Facebook page, and you can follow us on Twitter. But most importantly, you can share our podcast with friends, family, and anyone you know would be interested in real crime and the minds that solve those crimes. So thank you for listening.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan. Sound engineered by Terrell Parham. Music composed by Simba Tsumba. Logo art by Jim Clementi. Real Crime Profile is produced by XG Productions and distributed by Wondery.
For advice and support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0203 866 4107, or you can go on the website www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline, free phone 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, safety, shelter or counselling, call Genesis, the 24-hour hotline, 214-946-4357, or go on their website, www.genesisshelter.org, or the domestic violence hotline on 800-799-7233.
If you're a regular listener to the show, you know we have great brands like Blue Apron, Audible, and Casper advertising with us, and they keep coming back because our listeners really respond to them, which we're really thankful for. Well, if you happen to own a business or manage the advertising buy for one, then you should consider advertising on Real Crime Profile. Podcast advertising is on the rise, and it's one of the most effective ways of reaching consumers on the go today. So please go to Wondery.com/advertisers. Again, it's Wondery.com/advertisers, and get in touch with us. Thanks.